Good morning, everybody. I'm sitting in my car here in South Boston. I'm taking some people out to teach them a little bit of history in a little while. But I've got a few moments here to relax, watch some state troopers go by and this, that, and the other. Watch the world go by, in a sense. Anyway, I'm going to use that time to explain how a bond market works. People have asked me how do bonds work. It's not very complicated, but people like to make it a bit complicated, so ordinary people will not understand how it works. But I will simplify it so everybody will understand. A government spends frequently more money than it raises in taxation. That excess amount of money is referred to as a deficit. So that deficit must be made up by borrowing money from somebody foolish enough to lend the government money so they can spend that money. As years go by, the accumulated deficits each year is added onto the national debt, and interest must be paid on the national debt, and it, in the fullness of time, becomes a monster milestone around the neck of a society, and it will eventually sink that society. Now, people think governments can just print money. In actual fact, a modern Western government cannot just print money. It needs to get it from someplace else. Fortunately for them, there is an entity that can actually print money, and that entity is known as the Federal Reserve System. It's a national bank given a monopoly or a license to actually issue credit or money into the system, and that is like a magic wand, and needless to say, that is a nice little thing to have. That bank then will obviously make a huge amount of profit. You can actually print money, and it'll operate as a bank, and much of its profits is given back to the government. But that is not the function, in essence, of a central bank. It's not to make a profit. It is actually to exist as a lender of last resort. It is there to bail out entities that have lost a lot of money by issuing loans or money to those people and save their hides. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and that liability or that loss of wealth is transferred ultimately to the back of the taxpayer, and fortunately for the taxpayers' mental health, they do not understand the system, so they don't actually understand that they are being royally screwed, and we all live happily ever after. Anyway, getting back to how the government gets its money. The government must borrow money. They will do that by issuing what's known as bonds, B-O-N-D-S, bonds. These are just simply IOUs. We don't want to call them IOUs because people would realize that giving an IOU or taking an IOU or lending money is not the brightest thing they could be absolutely doing, because you may not be paid back. And if you are paid back, you may not be paid back to the full value of what you gave 10 years before that or whatever. These bonds can be any length of time for duration, anything from a day to 5 days to 10 days to 2 weeks to 3 months to 2 years to 1 year to 10 years to 30 years. Some governments have actually issued bonds of a duration of 100 years. The person that buys that bond, of course, is long dead by the time he's paid back his money. And that is just how insane it is. Now, they call them different names depending on the length of duration. Short duration bonds will be known as bills, B-I-L-S. Mid-range length of bonds will be known as notes, N-O-T-E-S. And longer range will be known as treasury bonds. That is just how it is in the United States. In England and other places, they call them different things. In England, for example, a bond is known as a gilt, G-I-L-T, gilt. So gilts, they're just another name for bonds. And in Germany, they're known as bunds, B-U-N-D-S, etc. They're known as different things in different countries, but they all actually function the same way. So let's say that the government wishes to borrow $30 billion. It will go into, it'll have an auction, and it will have $30 billion of bonds to sell. Let's just say it's 30 units, okay? They will say in effect that, okay, we are going to sell these bonds and we are going to ask you to pay $100 for each of these bonds, or 100 units, and we will pay 5% at the end of the duration of the bond. And let's say the bond is 10 years in duration. So what we'll do is, you buy this for 100 units or $100, and at the end of 10 years you will get your money back. In the meantime, each year we will pay you an interest fee known as a coupon, and the coupon is going to be 5%. And in $1 billion of bonds, you will be paid $50 million a year interest, and at the end of the 10 years, bingo, you will get your $1 billion back. That is how that is set up. But it is an auction. So some people will come to the auction and they will wish to buy some of these bonds, and they will pay the $100 for the bond, and they'll be paid the 5%. These people are eager to buy the bonds, and they will pay full price, which is known as par, P-A-R. Okay, so they'll buy the bond at par, they will put the bond in their pocket, and they will go home. So let's say of the $30 billion of bonds that was on offer, let's say 17 billion have been sold in that first round of bidding. Now those guys have gone home. There's still 13 billion left to sell. Well, the guys next bidding, then they might say to themselves, we are not prepared to pay 100, we're going to pay 99 for these. So they will bid $99 for each bond, and the government will sell maybe 4 billion at 99, and then of course those guys go home, and it continues down, and the last of the bonds might be sold at 97. So the fellas that bought at 97 obviously have got a better value than the guys that bought at 100. Okay? So that actually changes the interest rate, because all of them are going to get back $50 million a year. And if you had paid the 100, that is 5%. But if you paid 97, it's obviously more than 5%, because your principal is smaller, but your interest rate is larger. So you might be actually paying, I'm not doing the calculations now in my head, but you might be paying, might be being paid 5.1% for that particular bond. And that is how the auction goes. If it is a successful auction, you will get your entire $30 billion sold, and you will get X amount of money. If it's a good auction, you'll get close to the $30 billion. If it's a slightly bad auction, you'll get slightly less than $30 billion. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, like no different than going to a mart selling 30 calves, you will be going home with money and the job done. And that is how a bond auction works. So there's different prices. Now, not everybody can bid on these government bonds. There is, I believe, 15 primary dealers. These are big banks, and they are the only ones that will be able to purchase these bonds. So at the end of the day, $30 billion of bonds have been sold. Now, if there's strong auction, it means there's more buyers, which means most of the bonds might be sold at par, which is 100. Okay? The amount of buyers, the amount of bids that's put into an auction, we'll say selling $30 billion, the total amount of bids might be, for example, $75 billion of bids will be put in. So there's 75 billion bids put in to cover 30 billion, and that is referred to as the bid to cover ratio, or ATIO, which is 2.5. That is about normal, that is about a success. Now, the difference between the highest price paid and the lower price, which took to sell the final dribs and drabs of the 30 billion, which is maybe from 100 down to 97 or whatever. That difference is known as the tail, okay? You want that tail to be very tight, because the bigger the tail, it means the harder it was to sell the entirety of the bonds. You do not want a big tail. So you will always hear people referring to the bid to cover ratio and the tail. Those are the two things that's described with bond, and that takes care of the selling of the bond, okay? God forbid the day comes when there are not enough bids to cover the entire 30 billions. Let's say, for example, there was the total bids bid at different prices, of course, would be about $27 billion. That then is what would be referred to as a failed auction, because they didn't even get enough buyers to cover the amount of supply at any price whatsoever. To my recollection, which is pretty good, that has only happened maybe once in the entire decades that I've been following the bond markets. It's not a very good thing. So the bond market, the bond auction has to be cancelled, and it's not good. That has happened once. I only remember that happening once, but I suspect it's going to be happening very, very shortly, very, very soon, especially over in England, France, and Germany, where there is, as I speak, talk of confidence being lost in the bond markets. Now, that's how the government gets its money. When the bond becomes to maturity 10 years later, the entire 30 billion is paid off, which must be paid off by going out into the market and borrowing another 30 billion plus, and the game continues, okay? As long as the interest rates are relatively low, this can be sustained for quite a while, because the interest rates paid every year is not very onerous. It has been like that for the longest time. It might be 1%. So at 1%, you can cover a national debt of 37 trillion by just paying maybe $380 billion a year. But now all of a sudden it's up to 5%. And now, of course, at that interest rate, you have to pay almost $2 trillion interest rate. So there is a problem. Now, the final thing I will discuss is how interest rates actually change. Let's say the primary dealer has bought his bond, he paid $100 for it, it pays 5%. He now wishes to sell that bond on to somebody else, a smaller guy. That's what's known as the secondary market, when those guys sell on to the regular customer down the line of the food chain. The primary market is when they bid for the government bond at an auction. Now they're selling their bond to the other people, whether it's an investment bank or whether it's a mutual fund or whether it's this, that, the other. If he can sell that bond, if there's a big demand, and if he sells that bond for, we'll say, $101, remember now the coupon or the interest paid is the same, so the price is higher. So the interest rate in that situation for the guy buying the secondary market bond is actually different than what it was for the first guy, because now when the price goes up, he has to pay $101. He's only getting the 5% back, the 50 million a year back if it was $1 billion. So he's actually paying a different rate of interest. He's actually getting a different rate of interest. He's actually getting a lower rate of interest, maybe even 4.9%, because instead of dividing instead of dividing 50 by a billion, which is 5 by 100, he is in fact dividing 50 by 101, which turns out to be 4.9. So at every single moment of every single day that the markets are in operation, the prices are changing. because the prices of the bonds are changing, but the interest paid is static and staying the same. The actual effective interest rate is changed by that manner right there. That might be a little bit hard to grasp until you actually think about it, okay? Again, the interest payment, the coupon is the same at $50 million a year. So if you're paying less to get the $50 million, it means that the interest rate is different than if you were paying more to get the interest of $50 million. And that is how interest rates change by the minute during the course of a market day. Now, that is the bond market explained in 15 minutes. It's not complicated, but it does take a little bit of consideration. All you really need to know is that the government needs to hope that there's enough buyers for its bonds so the auction will be a success. And then you have to understand that the interest rates, all interest rates, are set by the market each and every day. The Federal Reserve actually sets no interest rates at all, contrary to popular belief. What it does is it sets just one interest rate, which is the federal funds rate. And it doesn't actually set the rate, it sets a range that it would like the interest rate to be within. And that range is always 0.25%. So if they want it at 2%, they will set a range, for example, 2 to 2.25. They want to keep it in that range. If the interest rates changing in the market are going above 2.25, the Federal Reserve will go into the market and either buy or sell bonds to affect the supply and demand, which will affect the price, which in turn will affect the interest rate and bring it back to where they want it to be. Okay, so I expect a little bit of a panic in the bond markets. The Federal Reserve will need to go in there and purchase bonds left, right and center with money created out of just thin air, and that is what breeds inflation. And in a crisis, it actually breeds massive inflation known as hyperinflation. And that is what I expect in the coming weeks or months, if not sooner, possibly beginning in Britain. We shall see. All right, thank you for watching that off the cuff video.